The day is in the midst of a year-long affordable housing study in the region. What specifically do you think the legislature should do to help people who can't afford to buy a home or who are struggling to rent an apartment?
Sure. Great question. That's an issue that affects a lot of the rural towns that the 47th encompasses. A lot of those towns, their zoning regulations are pretty restrictive when it comes to affordable housing component, and the current requirements and what is being allowed, I think it's making it difficult for some of the planning and zoning commissions to work with. And I don't know if the current legal maneuverings that allow for it to happen in rural districts and in other places is enough of an incentive to make it happen that best works for the town and for providing people a chance for an affordable housing. In Lisbon, for instance, where I live, there's constant talk from young professionals, people who are just out of school, out of college, that they can't afford to find anywhere to stay in town. And I think it ties into the whole issue of, can we keep our young workforce in the area? And, in too many times with my former students, former athletes that I've either taught or coached, it's almost a given that when they graduate from college, where are they going to go to Boston? Are they going to go to New York? Are they going to go to somewhere where there's, jobs that suit them, and also the housing component that they can afford to do. In Lisbon, there's been a few small developments that have met the requirements, and I know that the Planning and Zoning Commission has been working very hard on adopting the new requirements of the regulations that will allow for expanded use in that. I don't know I know the governor has spoken on this as well. Does there need to be some more of an incentive-based situation? I know some towns other in the state have tried to provide housing dedicated just to some teachers, because the teachers can't afford to live in those particular communities. I don't think that's particularly an issue in eastern Connecticut, but something that would maybe incentivize towns to develop housing that is, both suits the needs of the community, but also allows those towns to maintain somewhat of their either rural character and not have something that's really goes against what would be aesthetically and fitting in with what I would call the current design of the town is a difficult one.
Okay. Connecticut recently enacted a law designed to provide safeguards against lawsuits from out-of-state patients seeking abortions in Connecticut, and providing and providers, who help them. Do you support efforts to make Connecticut such a safe haven?
Absolutely. And again, this is obviously a big issue this year in the election, something that you probably 2 years ago would have never thought it was a local or a statewide issue. But obviously with the Supreme Court ruling, it has become a state issue, although certain Tennessee-type senators looking to remove that from becoming as much of a state issue. But yes, I fully support any type of legislation that would protect healthcare providers in every capacity, and anyone else who might be assisting women who might travel from states where accessing proper women's rights is no longer available. And whether it's the people who are helping bringing them here, or whether it's the physicians and anyone in the healthcare community that would be providing them, I'm fully supportive of offering any available protection to them against states that might try to go after them for providing that service.
Okay. The state surplus has grown to over $4 billion. Do you support decisions to use some of that surplus to lower the state's pension debt? Or do you think that more should be turned back to the taxpayers?
I fully support lowering that debt. I believe, and again, I apologize, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a pretty big chunk of that debt was reduced in this last cycle. And not only is it good for the long-term financial health of the state, it saves, hundreds of millions of dollars in interest and payments that would be having to made. So I believe, I could be wrong, I believe the number was roughly in the $4 billion of the $40 billion has been paid down, and I would support continuing to try to aggressively pay that down for the benefits of the long-term sustainability of those programs.
How should Connecticut move forward to address climate change with the region, with regards to electric vehicles, wind power, and other clean energy?
Sure. I do support, I'm a firm believer in climate change and the fact that things do need to be done to reduce and provide a better future for our kids and our grandkids. And I think steps are being made with some of the affordability now of the electric vehicles. I am concerned about the infrastructure of the charging capabilities, and also the fact that electric rates in Connecticut are fairly high. So trying to keep those costs down so that the charging of electric vehicles does not become an excessive cost for those users. I think the current plan of trying to expand the charging stations throughout the state is a good idea. I would like to see maybe some incentives for some small businesses, be it family restaurants, small grocery stores, places that people might be in and out in an hour or so, where, rather than just some of the big chains that are able to put in some Tesla charging booths, if some of the smaller restaurants and grocery stores could have those charging stations, I think they would get utilized by their customers. But I think that just to expect a business like that to put it in on their own with the idea that it will perhaps attract more customers is probably not all that realistic. So, some kind of incentive for them to provide a charging station for their customers would be, I think, successful.
Do you think the 2020 election was conducted fairly and Joe Biden won? Do you support early voting and voting by mail initiatives?
Yes, and yes. And I guess I'll hit each one at a time. Yes, I firmly believe that the most recent presidential election was fairly won by President Biden. And I think it remains a threat to our democracy that there are numerous states that are pushing election deniers in critical positions, such as Secretary of the State and other positions that could impact the future, not just statewide elections, but I will particularly say the 2024 presidential election. I fear a little bit for that with some of the states that are still making that push, be it Arizona or some of the others that not sure that the will of the people will be fully recognized. So yes, I believe the president won fairly, and I don't think election fraud was something that was a factor in that. I do support early. What was it? Was the second one early voting? I'm sorry. Yes. So early voting. The more accessibility to voting for all eligible voters in any way. I think Connecticut's one of the areas that maybe we aren't quite up to where some of the other states are in terms of ability to vote early and to have the absentee ballots as easily accessible. And so anything that eases the ability of registered voters to vote, I'm fully in support of. And I think your third one was a three-part question.
The mail vote by mail.
Yes. So voting by mail, it appears to be successful in other places. I'm fully supportive of that. The earlier it comes in, I would like to see some states that don't allow the counting of the mail-ins to happen until a certain time. I'd rather see the counting start as early on election day as possible, or however that can work best, so that you're not faced with what I'll call deceptive early returns that sometimes come in, where you see a candidate in the lead and then suddenly a lot of mail-in ballots are counted and people wonder how that shift could happen so dramatically when those are all, legal and fair ballots. They just sometimes aren't counted until a certain time. So how to incorporate that to avoid the perception of, my goodness, how could things change so dramatically? Because, as has been noted, particularly during the pandemic, oftentimes the mail-in or the absentee ballots favored one party over the other, those that were more reluctant to go to the polls during the pandemic. And that created, I think, some concern on the other party as far as the viability. And I will add one last thing on the voting, another issue that you didn't mention on there. I do fully support ranked choice voting. There was a good editorial in the Day today by Chris Powell of Manchester about the ranked choice voting, and it's something that does seem to have support of both parties to a degree, and I think it would perhaps encourage more candidates who appeal to the overall base, and I think it would also help diminish to a degree what I'll call extremist candidate views who can appeal to a small group that might be enough to get them at least through a primary and sometimes in some areas through the general election. So.
The 47th district has a lot of small towns and a piece of Norwich. The school funding issues are always a big question in the annual town budgets, and Norwich is facing a $385 million referendum for school construction. Is there anything the legislature can do to re-examine or restructure the school funding mechanisms to help small towns and all towns in general afford school infrastructure and school funding?
I would hope so. I don't know if I would say all towns in general. I think, not to be a Gold Coast snob, but Greenwich probably doesn't need the same level of reimbursement on a school project that Norwich or New London or Sprague, for that matter, would need to get that to be a successful project without overly burdening the tax base of that community. I do fully support the Norwich project. I think one of the biggest decisions when people move to a town is the quality of their schools. And I know that was a factor when we chose to move into Lisbon. We're very happy with the school system in Lisbon. I'm on the Board of Education, and I think it's a great school there, as most of the smaller rural schools are, I think, in that area. And I think now it's a factor for people to move to those towns. And on a positive for Lisbon, but on a negative for Norwich, and I think part of this is their aging schools. We've had the benefit of hiring some wonderful teachers into Lisbon who have taught in Norwich. And I think not only do the aging schools make it more difficult to attract families with kids into Norwich because they see the status of the schools, but it also, I think, is a factor in retaining some of their real high-quality teachers who are perhaps inclined to look to go elsewhere. So I would hope that the current reimbursement, I don't know what the percentage was that Norwich was given, but it surprised me at the lower level that it was. I thought it was a little bit higher. I thought some of the other districts in need had received a higher number in the past, but I could be wrong on that. but I do think that perhaps that number could go up, and I'd like to see that reimbursement also sometimes they put a limit on facilities, whether it's an auditorium or a gymnasium or some of the fields, and they can only reimburse up to a certain amount based on your school numbers. And there are some schools, I'm familiar with one just outside of my district. Griswold High School has a wonderful music program, and when they built that school, they made the auditorium a little bit bigger, and I believe they had to pay a little more to do so. But it would have been nice if that could have been reimbursed. And it fills up all the time for their musicals. In the same way that if Norwich is able to, add additional gym space, some additional field space. It's wonderful that they've just reinstated their middle school sports programs, which haven't been in existence for many years. London's Lou Allen has done a great job getting those back in place. And that's a big factor in people choosing the schools. They want to see extracurricular activities and some of those programs. And if the reimbursement doesn't cover the ability to provide adequate facilities, then it becomes, where do you get those facilities from? And some towns have been able to do that. If you look at Wyndham, their new community center in Wyndham is a beautiful facility with a pool and a basketball court and a wrestling room, and it's a wonderful facility that the state, reimburse quite a bit of that, and perhaps that's something that Norwich could look at in the future. I know they could probably never propose something like that now with the school plan going forward, but it'd be something that I would love to see in Norwich, somewhere in Norwich in the future, because the more facilities you can provide, options for the kids and families to take part in, I think that really brings people in the town. And right now in Norwich, you're kind of limited recreationally, and if the schools don't have enough gym space and all of that, it's tough to find places to have those programs. So